Bede, my head is filled with all sorts of arguments from theists, very smart theists. Some are philosophers, some are scientists. And I have spoken to some atheistic scientists and philosophers who attack the arguments of the theists. So my head is spinning a little bit, as you can imagine. But what I thought would be interesting is to reverse the procedure and have a philosopher give arguments against God, and then maybe we'll let the theists see if they can answer those arguments.
Well, before addressing that directly, let me say the following. You often find people, in particular scientists, who say you can't prove the existence of God, but then you can't disprove it either. Now, I think they have a certain picture. It's like you can't prove that there's no life in the rest of the universe. You could never cover it all. You can't prove that there's not a God. Might be out there somewhere, but we never come across him. Now, that's to make the existence of God an empirical hypothesis. You could encounter him in some way. And that seems to me not to be true to the traditional understanding of God. God is not like one of the ancient gods of Greek or Rome, which were essentially incarnated. That is, you could come across them and they could do things in a physical fashion.
So that would be an empirical testing.
Right. And in fact, they haven't stood up very well as empirical hypotheses, and that's why we don't believe in them, right, by and large.
But the traditional theistic God is protected from that.
That's right. He's above and beyond anything in the natural world, and so that protects him. So if we wanted to argue the case for atheism, we would have to show that there's something incoherent in the idea of such a being as God is represented as.
That there's a contradiction.
That's right. Or it could be two things. It could be a contradiction, or it could be simply it hasn't been explained. So we don't know what we are postulating. But take the contradiction case. The argument that people find most appealing for the existence of God is the argument from design.
Yes.
Right? That has enormous appeal. And the argument that they find, I suspect, leads them to the opposite conclusion more than anything else, is the problem of evil. You meet so much suffering that seems to be unnecessary. How can that be consistent with the existence of a God who is in a position to stop any suffering? He's all-powerful, he knows what's going on. It's just not possible to reconcile these two. So that would give you a case where if you thought there was no way out, you'd say, well, the God cannot be as he is represented as being. A lot depends, of course, on what notion of God you have. So the God of the Old Testament is a pretty nasty piece of work. I mean, he's vindictive, racist, vengeful, cruel, and so on. But even with the sort
You seem to like him a lot.
Yes, he's one of my favourites. But even with the more sort of sanitized notion of God that you get in someone like Thomas Aquinas, there are traits that you might wonder whether they can cohere. So by sanitized, I mean, we're not thinking of any of the possible human weaknesses, but God is meant to be infinite mercy, justice, truth, and so on. So then the question is, well, does that make sense? And here you have to take it all case by case, but you might well say there are difficulties here of knowing what it comes to for God to be merciful even, because he can only be merciful if he can perform acts of mercy. And if he was just there, then the chance of being merciful wouldn't arise. Similarly with justice. All these notions are sort of social notions, and they require there to be other beings for God to manifest these virtues too, it seems to me. So
let me understand that. You're seeing a potential contradiction or incoherence between mercy and God of mercy and God of justice?
No, I wasn't quite thinking of that. Let me put it this way. Some people say, we just cannot know what justice is in God, or what mercy is in God. And we think, yes, that's right, his essence is completely opaque to us. We don't know what they are for him. Well, two problems. How can we speak of justice and mercy if we can't say anything at all about them in this case? But more interesting, I would think, is I don't mind that we can't say what justice is in God, because I don't know what justice is in anybody. I know what it is for someone to act justly. And so if there's any sense to the supposition that God is just, it would have to be that you describe possible situations in which he has to give a verdict, and he'd always give the just verdict. Right. So in other words, it's this picture of God as sort of all on his own with his divine essence, and we can't penetrate to that, can be replaced by one where we imagine God doing the sorts of things that we do, which manifest kindness, benevolence, and so forth. And that, of course, is a bit like the Old Testament picture, but there he manifested things that we would regard as highly undesirable traits, like taking revenge and things of that order. So in a way, this is on the theist side. It's saying you don't need to worry about this impenetrable character, because you would, in favourable circumstances, be deciding on one of God's virtues in essentially much the same way as you decide on a person's virtue. The problem, of course, is how could he manifest them? How could we have any grounds for saying that this is God being merciful? Because he is essentially a being outside space and time. So any being that we came across would not be prima facie God. There'd be so many other naturalistic explanations. After all, why shouldn't the universe be populated somewhere or other by extremely intelligent beings who can do all sorts of things that we can't do? But they would still fall infinitely short of being God. So if somebody claimed to be God, imagine you have a booming voice comes down from the heavens.
I've been waiting.
You've been waiting. All right, well, the day comes. And this voice warns mankind, if you don't change your ways, then we're going to have another one of these famous plagues. Now, and suppose it all comes to pass as predicted. Some might say, well, what better reason could you have for supposing there to be a God than that? I mean, he knows the future, and he's obviously clearly in command of natural events. Well, once more, I think you'd have to say, obviously, we can't explain that at the moment, but what we've got is a phenomenon in this physical universe. In the past, we've confronted equally puzzling occurrences. If you went back to the Middle Ages with your laptop computer, they would think that you were sent by the devil, right? I mean, it would make no sense to them that you could do the things that our technology enables us to do. Very well, this voice that comes down from the heavens, it could be that there's a visitation from a much more intelligent body of beings, and that this is their way of giving us a message. And it's just that the gap between that, far-fetched and puzzling though it may be, and postulating God is so enormous. And that brings us to perhaps what the main difficulty is with the idea of God, and that is just the idea that a pure spirit could interact with physical things. I think that's very hard to make sense of, because our whole notion of causation is as expressed in sort of verbs like to crush, to bend, to cut, to squeeze, to burn, which all involved some agent acting upon something and a certain state of affairs resulting. Well, if you're a pure spirit, what does acting upon anything mean? So God is protected from refutation, possibly, but at the cost of unintelligibility about his most basic trait.
Well, I mean, I can imagine how a disembodied spirit can have something like what we call telekinesis, which people think exists, which may not, but you can imagine where a mind can move matter. I mean, you can conceptually think how at least that might occur, that you will something. I mean, we think we have a will, that we're moving things in our brain. Now, maybe that's not the case, but at least it feels like that could be the case.
It feels like that only slightly contrived situations.
Yes.
You see, you are speaking voluntarily at the moment. You don't will your tongue to do the movements it does. You don't will the sentence to start with such and such a word. You just speak spontaneously, naturally. So this hypothetical mechanism has no part to play in most cases.
Yes.
It comes out when you think of, say, trying unsuccessfully to do something and putting a lot of effort into it to no avail.
Yes.
But they're just one kind of case, and they shouldn't be the model for understanding behavior generally. And here's another point. Suppose a person says, well, you could have a spiritual force, a non-physical force acting upon the world. A good example of a possible non-physical being is given with poltergeists. And you've heard lots of stories about them moving furniture from room to room. And there certainly is something very mysterious going on here. Well, is it right to speak of them as being spiritual or even non-physical? Because think, if a poltergeist can move the furniture, then he could also exert a force on you. So you'd feel yourself pushed or pulled. And pushing and pulling is something that gives you evidence for there being a body impinging upon yours. So it might be completely invisible, but what you would conclude, I think, at least initially, is the world contains some beings which we didn't know it contained, but let's find out more about them. Next time it pushes me, I'm going to see if it's got a flat surface by pushing in that direction, and so on. So the contours of this being could eventually be made clear to you. And so it seems to me that although it starts off looking like something out of this world, it turns out to be very much of this world.
Well, what you're saying is that even if poltergeists exist, which we may not agree they do, but if they would, and they would have the ability to exert force on material things, then they would have to be some strange thing of this world.
Yeah.
But that would not indicate that they are a non-physical and a godlike
Well,
existence.
that's right. And once more, there's that huge infinite gap between a very strange inhabitant of this world and a being right outside space and time.
So what does that say about the theistic hypothesis of this immaterial, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, perfectly free, all the virtues of God?
Right. Well, there's some ways of making sense of these. As I mentioned, you can have a false picture about we can't penetrate to God's essence as regards any of the attributes that he's said to have. And I wish to say that, well, he could manifest these in principle. And the problem is what would count as a manifestation of these? But then, as well as there being possible inconsistencies in some of these notions, we have moral considerations that might weigh with us. So could you really call a God infinitely just if he punishes all the successors of Adam and Eve for their sins? Doesn't that go against the grain a bit? You had no say in it, so why should you suffer in consequence? Can you really accept that there could be hellfire for all eternity? Isn't that a knockdown argument against a creed that goes along with that? It's so grotesque. So you've got a whole lot of different issues. You can make some sense of some of them, but difficulties remain.